the convener of the platform Nigeria, Pastor Poju Oyemade. Can we make that applause louder? You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, we may all be seated. First time I'm wearing a cap at the platform. All right, I won't take too much of a time, but I want to, because I think we have very solid speakers who will share their thoughts and ideas. But I want to share something, and this came as a result of a teaching that I actually did in church, and somebody sent me a message saying that this shouldn't be just a church message. It's something that the country should hear. And I will cut it short by just going to, and part of the message, on a study that World Bank did. And what they were doing was they were looking for the importance of intangible capital. And I believe that this is what the country should be looking at now, which is intangible capital. In this study some years back, the World Bank Environmental Economics Department set out to make an assessment on the relative contributions of various kinds of capital to economic development. It was a study, all right, which was about they were really trying to find out the wealth of nations, where the wealth of nations really was. So they started measuring capital for the 21st century. They started out by defining what was called natural capital. They examined the different types of capital. And the definition of natural capital is the sum of non-renewable resources, including things like oil, natural gas, coal, mineral resources, cropland, pasture land, and forested area. Then they examined the second type of capital, which is also tangible, and they looked at it and they called it produced or built capital. This is the sum of the machinery, equipment, infrastructures, buildings, structures that are owned by those nations. So they looked at what is called natural capital. They looked at built-up capital. But then they discovered when they added both together that the natural and produced capital, when they added it, the economists found something big was still missing in the wealth of those nations. What was missing was still the vast majority of the world's wealth. In other words, when they looked at the world's wealth, when they added both capitals together, or types of capital together, a substantial amount of the wealth was still missing. It wasn't accounted for by the addition of both types of capital. So if you added both types of capital described here, you could still not account for the country's level of income all over the world. The rest they found, which is the greater majority, was a result of what they called intangible factors. This is what we call intangible capital, such as trust among the people, an efficient judicial system, human capital, the value of institutions. All these and others constituted the largest amount of the wealth of these nations. Once one takes into account all the world's natural resources and produced capital, they still found out that 80% of the wealth of rich countries and 60% of those even poorer ones were in the form of what they called intangible capital. Now, I'm going somewhere with this for this country. The bottom line is the rich countries are rich because of the skill level of their citizens, and the quality of institutions that support economic activity. The first quality they found out was the skill level of their citizens. This is why today, wealthy nations that know this are targeting the skilled workforce of nations around the world because they know the future and wealth of a nation is found in those people. They are not asking for a transference of our oil fields. They are not asking for a transference of our land, farmlands. What they want is the skilled people in those countries. And this is a basic mistake, all right, with the way we define wealth in Africa. We say that Africa is the wealthiest country in the world, evaluating only what is called natural capital. We'll talk about the gold, we'll talk about the diamonds, we'll talk about the oil, we'll talk about our farmlands. But we don't think of wealth in the form of human capital. This is why they are not coming for a transference of those things, but for a transference of talent. They know where the wealth of nations really is. Now, if we allow all young talents to slip out and migrate out of this country, thinking of wealth in terms of tangible capital, we will be making a costly mistake, and that will hold for generations. Except there is a good plan, all right, to lure the talents back into coming into this country later on. Wealthy nations focus on developing the skills of their citizens, producing people who are capable of doing things that only few people on the earth can do. Nations that have developed the skills of their citizens attract material capital into those nations. They focus on the unseen, while others focus on the seen. If we really know what the wealth is, then the first thing we will look out for in this country is our educational system. The second thing we will look out for is how much specialized vocational training is going to produce highly skilled people. Now, these two things came out of this report. Nigeria was mentioned, but I don't want to go into that. But I will say this. The report says that some countries, the way they have been run or are being run, have a negative intangible capital. That is, they are destroying the existing intangible capital within those nations. And how that is being done is that the rampant corruption that goes on in those nations, such that models are not being created where you have models of people that most of the models become people that are wealthy as a result of rent-seeking. So the younger people now start thinking whether or not within this environment acquisition of intangible capital is necessary. The second they found out is the power of these intangibles and what happens when they are not present. They found out if all the conditions for development, all right, other than physical capital were present. In other words, all the intangibles were present, but these people don't have money. They found out that capital in the form of cash will soon be generated locally or will come in the form, all right, come from outside nations into the country. If these qualities are not in operation, then aid will be necessarily unproductive. Thus, if the mainspring for progress and development are present, material progress will occur without external assistance. If they are not present, it will not occur with all the external assistance. Now, this brings me to my conclusion. People ask me about the platform, and I want to say something here, and that's why you do platform, and why don't you go just beyond an event and, and people talk about engagement and taking actions and, try to implement things. First of all, let me say this, that in a democracy, there are different institutions that cause a democracy to work. I think Donna Brazil will speak about that in her session. And there are different institutions that emerge. Some institutions find out what are the thoughts and ideas that will bring about progress to the collective, publish those things such that it gets into the consciousness of the people, for they know something. That the only two things politicians understand, who are the decision makers, is how do we get to power, and the second language they understand is if we're in power, how do we hold on to it? This is the language and voice that politicians who can change things understand. Once they understand that these ideas that will make them, or these are the ideas that will make them gain power or hold on to power, they will implement them. It has very little to do with compassion, but with power. So people keep asking me, what about doing something? Let me announce, I am a pastor. That is my primary calling. The message I will say on Sunday is more important to me than this, because that is my calling. Now, I do understand that people, any institution that works, we want to transfer a lot of responsibilities to it. So I understand why people make noise about pastors. Let me tell you a story. Almost about 7 years ago, I was in my house, about 5:30 a.m., and my phone rang. And when the phone rings at that point, I know it's an emergency. So I picked up the phone. And a young lady was on the other end, and she said, I come to church and all of that. There's a cow on the highway that is burning. Pastor, there's a cow on the highway that is burning. You've got to do something. I said, I am in my house at 5:30. I said, have you called the fire department? No. Have you called police? No. Is the pastor that you're calling to do something? What do you want me to do about it? But I understood her thinking that, that's just the way people think. All right, we transfer responsibilities to an institution that works. So let me say this, all right, just for people to understand, because we have done our part. Broadcast ideas, push those ideas into the consciousness of people. There are other institutions, there are other organizations that should run with it. But let me just say this. That these ideas are pushed out into the consciousness of the populace. And the way it works in a democratic system of government is that once it gets into the consciousness of the populace, and people realize that this is how we can get into power by the implementation of ideas that are popular with the public, then major political platforms, all right, bring it on board, fashion their manifestos around it in order to win the people over and implement those things in order to retain power. So my concluding statement is, as we approach 2023, which is the next election, the political class should be aware, because the transference that is going on of this type of capital is among the young people. They constitute almost 70% of the population of this country. And what I just described there about intangible capital is their cry. Therefore, the political class, you will do well to listen to these ideas. And whether or not people respond now, it will get to a critical mass where the only way to get into power and to retain power will be rallying around these ideas, implementing these ideas in order to do it. The next 30 years of this country, a well-organized political party can hold power or get power in this country if they understand these thoughts, embrace them, and implement them. God bless you.